Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum. We have a very cool video today. This is going to be an exploration of the development of the CZ-75 from its first design concept through until approximately 1992 when the CZ-75B is introduced. We're looking at all the pre-B variations, starting of course with the really super cool and super rare slab side or short rail model of the CZ-75, the very first production pattern. Now, a bunch of you guys have been asking me for this video, and finding a bunch of historically appropriate old vintage CZ-75s is a bit tricky. And honestly, what made this video possible is that Royal Tiger Imports got a big, huge batch of CZ-75s imported from a security agency in Europe that no longer wanted them. And that batch included models of all different periods and varieties, including the very early short rail guns. And picking through what they had brought in allowed me to pull out the specific historical examples that you see here that allow me to tell you this story incrementally. So big thanks to Royal Tiger for making this possible. Now, so let's start with CZ. In the 1950s was a government-owned company, a gun factory in Czechoslovakia, and they had two different roles. Of course, one of their roles is manufacturing firearms for the Czechoslovak military. CZ has a long history of some really brilliant designers and some really fantastic firearms. A few in the 1950s, maybe not so great, but we're not talking about that. The other role of CZ at this time was actually to create products for export sale to bring foreign currency into Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia, of course, was under a communist government, and they were trying to run a planned economy, but they couldn't manufacture everything they needed within Czechoslovakia or even within the Eastern Communist bloc. They had to import some stuff from outside, and to import stuff from the outside, they needed some sort of Western currencies, be they dollars or pounds or German marks, whatever. They needed something. And one of the ways that the country brought in foreign currency was by selling small arms. So some of the really high production CZ firearms from the 1950s, post-World War II period, like the CZ-50, like the CZ Duo, these are compact, basically carry pistols. The CZ-50 is in 32 ACP. The CZ Duo is a 25 ACP pocket pistol. And these are guns that are manufactured primarily for export sale. Hundreds of thousands of these pistols were sold at export by Czechoslovakia to bring in foreign currency. Now, by the 1960s, those guns aren't selling so well. They're not obvious. They're not great guns. They're getting obsolete, and they don't really fill a lot of the security role that's starting to become a more significant market in Western Europe and the United States, North America, like everything outside of the Eastern Bloc. So the Czech Ministry of Trade, in its role in partially determining what CZ makes, tells CZ to come up with a 9mm pistol. That's a suspiciously capitalistic sort of cartridge at this time and place, but that's what the foreign market wants. So let's make one of those and sell it. That's the design brief essentially. Is they like 9mm, so let's make them a 9mm and get some money. CZ has a fantastic designer on tap to do this work. It is a gentleman named František Koucký. Now, Koucký and his brother Josef Koucký are a legendary pair of brothers in Czech firearms design who did a whole ton of different projects for CZ over many decades. Interestingly, at this point, František is actually already retired. He retired in 1967. He's getting a pension, but he's really a gun designer, and he comes back to work on this project anyway because I think it was a project that he was really interested in. Koucký had actually developed a prototype for the Czech military, the P210, that was supposed to replace the Czech military's not so fantastic VZ-52 service pistols. The P210, I have a video coming on it. It's a really cool gun that never made it past the prototype stage because the Czechoslovak army decided to just keep this sort of craptacular guy anyway. So Koucký comes back, he starts working on this project, and initially it is a single stack, single action 9mm pistol, sort of service size, but you know, think of it more along the lines of something like a single action Walther P38. You know, it's potentially a military pistol, but not really aggressively getting into some of the futuristic or the modern concepts in service small arms. And in 1969, the Ministry of Trade actually notices this. And they're like, you know what? Let's make it double action and high capacity. That seems to be where we can really hit this market well. So change up your design, Mr. Koucký, and do that. And they do. There are a lot of assumptions that the CZ-75 took its design cues from the Browning high power. In reality, it actually took a lot more of its design cues from the SIG P210, and we'll get into that when we take one of these apart. But the major element that Koucký takes from the Browning high power is the magazine design. But he takes the double stack single feed high power magazine, improves it a bit, increases the capacity from 13 rounds up to 15, uses that as the base for his magazine for the CZ-75, gives it actually a very clever and innovative trigger mechanism, which we'll get into. And by 1973, this design is more or less finalized. There are 5 sample guns that are manufactured for factory testing. They take a little over a year to do factory testing, endurance testing. You know, this isn't a military trial. This is a private, well, not private, it's a state-run factory, but it's going to make this pistol to sell. It doesn't have to compete against anyone else, but it does have to compete against the entire market out in the rest of the world, so they want the gun to be as good as possible. They spend over a year doing that testing. In 1976, the gun is formally approved for production, March of 1976, and production actually begins in June of 1977. As always, takes them a little time to scale up production. And that first version of the gun is this guy, the short rail pattern. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at it, and we'll go through how the gun started and how it developed with these and a couple other examples as well. Let's start with a sort of walk around on the outside of the pistol. We have only right-handed controls here, so slide stop, safety, and magazine release are all on the right side of the pistol. Magazine is a 15-round capacity, double stack, single feed. Like I said, this is based on the Browning high power magazine. Now, this is a classic DASA pistol, so when it cycles, it recocks the hammer automatically, gives you a single action trigger pull. However, the hammer can start in the downward position, and you can cock it and then fire in double action with a long trigger press. There is no actual decocker on these pistols, although that would come much later in CZ-75 development. There is simply a right side manual thumb safety. And if you're a right-handed shooter, this is actually a pretty ergonomically effective design. Sits nicely under the thumb, like so. In fact, it's interesting that CZ actually brought in an industrial designer, a guy by the name of František, I'm going to try this, Koucký, to assist in the overall design of the CZ-75, because they realized to be a good commercial product, it not just needs to work well, it also kind of ought to look good. And grip design is excellent. It's really, I think, it is a classic, good-looking self-loading pistol. Anyway, sights are pretty basic, square notch and post, non-adjustable as they began. Our original grips are sort of this multi-pattern style here with a CZ logo up on the top. For markings, we have the CZ logo, Model 75 Caliber 9 Para, made in Czechoslovakia here on the left side. The right side has serial number on slide and frame, and on the barrel there, we have a Czech proof right up here and a proof date. So this is a pretty early one. They started production in '77. This is a 1979 production gun, and it's worth pointing out they actually started actual series production at serial number 10,001. So drop a 1 off the front digit of these to find out the actual position of the gun in serial production. This is the 14,603rd gun made. There are also 2 little marks back here on the slide and frame. Those are for disassembly. In order to take the slide off, you slide it back until those line up, right about there. And you can then pop out the slide stop pin, and the slide comes off the front of the gun. We have a non-captive recoil spring, a little too early in pistol design for that to be a common factor. We have a barrel. We have, of course, slide with a firing pin, This is a spring-loaded firing pin in here. In fact, we'll go ahead and pull it out. There is a plate on the back, a retaining plate, or rather like a 1911. So we pop that retaining plate down. It comes out. The firing pin is spring-loaded. So you have a firing pin return spring there. And that's, well, and then you've got an extractor pinned in place. So that's your gun pretty much top-end disassembled. And I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of people just assume that this is largely based on the high power. Well, this is a high power barrel. This is a CZ-75 barrel. The high power uses an open cam surface here. CZ-75 uses an enclosed cam lug, which is taken from the Petter, Charles Petter designed SIG 210. So in the CZ-75, they are both Browning style tilting barrel guns. In the CZ-75, it is the slide stop pin that acts as the cam itself that lifts and lowers the barrel as it travels backwards. In the Browning high power, there's actually a lug in the frame right here that interfaces with that slot in the barrel. So it's a little hard to see when I put them together, but you can see the oval. That's where that cam lug is put into the barrel. So they are, I mean, this may seem like nitpicky details, but as far as Browning style tilting barrel guns go, the high power and the CZ-75 actually have some significant differences. In fact, this is a good time to talk about the other big difference. So CZ-75 and our Browning high power. The Browning uses a trigger mechanism where pulling the trigger just pushes this little finger vertically up above the trigger. So the firing pin pushes up here, that bar acts like a seesaw and presses down like that, and then at the back end, it pushes down on this guy to actually release the trigger. The benefit of this, by the way, is that it kind of, by its very nature, can't fire if the gun's not fully in battery. What Koucký did with the CZ-75 is really quite different. So he has this stirrup-shaped trigger connector bar that wraps around both sides of the magazine. And if we look in here, when I pull the trigger back, the trigger is actually pinned up above where this linkage is. So prior to the CZ-75, a typical double action trigger like this would have the trigger connector here and then the trigger bar up on top. And when you pulled the trigger back, it actually pulled the connector bar forward, which then had to cam on another piece to reverse that direction and pull the hammer backward. What Koucký did is connect the trigger bar below the access pin of the trigger so that when you pull back, you are pushing the trigger bar directly against the hammer to cock it or release and fire it. This is, in large part, what led to the CZ-75 having a really good trigger, especially a really good trigger for late 1970s. Jeff Cooper kind of famously loved this thing. Apparently he loved it so much he basically smuggled one home from a visit back to the US. One of the other things that distinguishes the CZ-75 from most other pistols available at the time, and to a certain extent even today, is that the frame is actually on the outside of the slide rails. More typically, we are used to seeing slides on the outside of the frame rails, like on this high power. For the CZ-75, it is the opposite. The slide rails are on the inside. That helps protect them, and it's, again, one of the things that contributes to the CZ-75 having an excellent reputation for reliability. All right, so there's the CZ-75 disassembled. The fundamental aspects of this do not change over the course of production, but there are a bunch of small changes that do take place, so let's get into those. Let's start by talking about this short rail frame. This was the original design. Production started at 10,001, and production only ran until approximately 26,000, and that would be just very early in 1980. So this example, as you saw, is a 1979 dated gun. These early short rail style were made in 77, although only like 1,800 guns were actually made in 77. And then about 6,000, a little over 6,000 of them were made in 78 and 79. And then they changed up to the later full-length rail. So what happened here is there are several elements at play. when CZ started making these guns, they were actually forging and milling the frames. And this was an expensive and time-consuming process, and it was a big part of what was preventing them from making the guns faster and selling more of them. CZ decided to start looking into casting as an alternative to forging in order to speed up frame production. Now, they were having some issues with cracks showing up in these short frames already. They went ahead in about 1979 and outsourced some casting, frame casting to a Spanish company called Alpha, based in Eibar in Spain. CZ at the time didn't really have a lot of good casting infrastructure in its own factory, although they certainly do now. When the Spanish frames came back, they also showed signs of cracking. And so the problem here, although it is sometimes attributed to, crummy Spanish cast frames, the problem actually is that this frame length just isn't quite sufficient to get really good longevity out of the guns. And the solution was to increase the frame length. And that gives us the classic CZ-75 profile that we're used to seeing today. So at the beginning of 1980, they adopted this profile, and they also started going to cast frames, both ones that were outsourced briefly and then ones that were actually made by CZ in Uherský Brod. One of the other interesting things about these early 1970s dated guns is that they actually don't have a half-cock notch. You'd think this would be a pretty obvious sort of safety feature, but Koucký didn't think that this was necessary at the time. Instead, the firing pin is, of course, short enough that it doesn't protrude through the breech face when it's sitting normally, and it is coupled with a fairly hefty firing pin return spring so that you have to have a fair amount of force on the firing pin to actually get it to protrude through the breech face and have enough energy to detonate a primer. Now, Koucký's idea was that if you're cocking or decocking the gun and you slip, you don't need the half cock because that doesn't produce enough energy to actually fire a cartridge. So we can keep the gun nice and simple, and that'll be fine. Well, it turns out that's not fine. These guns were pretty quickly very popular with a lot of security organizations, and in around 1980, there were a couple of negligent discharges or accidental discharges, apparently in West Germany, where guys were holstering the guns and the hammers got caught on clothing or something and came back far enough to snap forward and actually discharge the pistols. So starting in 1980, right about the same time that we get the full-length frame rails, we get half-cock notches added to the fire control system. This was also something that was sometimes retrofitted into later guns because it is a pretty obvious safety feature that really should have been there the whole time. Now, moving forward to, this is a 1981 dated gun. This is what we normally think of as sort of a standard pre-B CZ-75. It's got the full-length frame rails. This particular one is serial number in the 34,000 range. Production got off to a somewhat slow start on these guns because they were time-consuming and complex to manufacture and quite high quality. Controls are all the same. This one doesn't have the caliber marking on the slide, and honestly, I have no idea why. There are variations through CZ production that you will see everywhere. So all of these changes that I'm going to go through here, kind of take them with a grain of salt. There are always going to be a few little exceptions. In general, gun stays the same except for the addition of the half-cock and the full-length slide rails. One of the next major changes that happens is a change from the standard finish being a really nice high-quality blue to the standard finish being a black enamel paint. And the main reason for this is CZ was casting frames by this point. They were doing a good job of it. The frames are fine, but a cast frame has a much rougher surface texture to it than a forged and then finished machined frame. And in order to get a good blued finish, they had to do a fair amount of polishing and surface treating, surface finishing to those frames, where if they used a relatively thick enamel paint, they could spend a lot less time polishing down the frame before they went ahead and gave it that paint. So this is adopted in 1984 as the standard new finish. They still made a variety of different finishes. They offered guns that were blued. They offered guns that were nickeled, two-tone, all sorts of different stuff. But the standard in '84 goes from blued to enamel paint. Now, this particular example is actually fairly late. This is a 1992 gun, and I can use it to show you a couple of the other changes as well. So in 1986, we get a couple of other things. The grip panels change to this checkered pattern instead of this earlier multi-pattern sort of style. There is also a slight enlargement to the trigger guard. This is a bit subtle to see, but if I put this 92 gun next to this early Slab Side, like if you look at the distance between the trigger and the trigger guard here, you can see that the trigger guard has gotten a little bit larger, and that happens in 1986. The magazines really didn't change over the course of production, except that until 1987, the magazines were actually engraved with the last 3 digits of the serial number of the gun they came with. Unfortunately, the examples I have here have all been used by police or security forces for many decades and don't have their original magazines with them anymore. The guns, of course, began with 5-digit serial numbers. By 1988, these were up to 182,000. And in 88, they decided to change the serial number style. And they went to a single letter and then a 4-digit number. So this is also a 1992 gun, but you see this style start with A0001 in 1988. And then in 1989, we also see a ring hammer appear. So less likely to actually come back and bite you on recoil than the original spur hammers. In 1993, we will see the release of the CZ-75B, which is a real delineator in models of CZ-75. But I wanted to show you this one as well because it's sort of one of the very last pre-B iterations. It has the rounded hammer, and it now has this flat sort of tactical faced trigger guard. This is something that people usually associate with the CZ-75B, because it was a change that was made almost at the same time, but not exactly, because this is a pre-B gun. It's just marked Model 75. It's moved, by the way, to a 2-line made in Czechoslovakia marking. Does not have the firing pin block, which is the hallmark feature of the B, but it does have this flat-faced trigger. By the end of the production period we're talking about here, by 1992, CZ had made about 320,000 of these pistols. It really was quite a successful design for them, and they would continue to make them for many, many years to go. They passed the 1 million mark in 2007. So the major overall features of our development process here, we start with the short rail guns. That lasts only until 1980. We then go to full-length rails, still blued. Next transition is going to be to black enamel paint as the primary finish. We will then see the replacement of the spur hammers with round hammers, the grip style changes, and ultimately we start getting some of the the transitional features that are going to lead into the CZ-75B model. All right, we're going to leave off the design history of this gun at 1992 or so, because at that point, everything changes. Czechoslovakia breaks up. It becomes the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The communist government falls. CZ becomes a privately owned enterprise. They start expanding into all sorts of other options for things they can do with the CZ-75. And there's a really good breaking point here of the CZ-75B, where they add a firing pin block that pretty well segregates the pre-B and the post-B patterns. And we'll get into later CZ-75 designs in some separate videos. One of the other things that I want to cover, however, is the patent and the intellectual property rights of the CZ-75. Because if you're familiar with this pistol, you probably know that it's been copied by everybody to a huge degree. That's, imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. Well, CZ has been highly flattered with the CZ-75 design, with the number of people that have copied it. And you might wonder, how is this, are they licensing this or what? No, the answer is basically all of these copies are unlicensed copies. And they exist because, well, František Koucký did in fact patent elements of the CZ-75, 4 specific ones, including particularly the trigger mechanism. However, as they are putting the gun through its factory testing, the Czech military, the Czechoslovak military, gets a little bit interested in it. Maybe this is something we should take a look at. It is still suspiciously capitalistically 9mm, but let's take a look. And so they proactively classify the patents as secret. They then consider the pistol, decide, no, you know what? That VZ-75, that'll do us nicely. So they don't end up adopting this. This is why you never see a reference to a CZ-75 pistol. There was no such thing. This was never adopted by the Czech military, although Czech police did. In fact, interestingly, the Czech military would eventually adopt the CZ-82, which has a lot of similar elements, certainly some kind of similar looks, in 9mm Makarov, but this is also a subject for a later separate video. Anyway, Koucký's patents get classified as state secrets, but then they never actually get around to bothering to unclassify them after the Army decides not to adopt the gun. And people aren't particularly, like, someone's not paying attention, and the gun is released onto the market with no public patent protection at all. And that is why these things get copied left, right, and center by everybody. It is a fantastic pistol design that shows up with no enforceable patents. So that's where it comes. That's why you see such widespread copying of the CZ-75. Now, patents are not permanent, and by typical patent length in the U.S. at least is 17 years. So after 15 or 20 years, all the patents cease to apply anyway, and people could go ahead and copy it. But people got a very much a head start in copying, knocking off the CZ-75 because of that oversight in CZ and the military and the government at the time. Like I said at the beginning, it really was Royal Tiger importation of a big batch of CZ-75s that gave me the opportunity to get these specific versions in the same place at the same time to film them for you. So big thanks to them. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. Today is actually Black Friday, unless you're watching this later, but it's our favorite shopping day of the year, as everybody knows. And so perhaps if you are looking for something cool for yourself or for that gun-interested person in your life, consider checking out Headstamp Publishing. We have a tremendous assortment of really cool firearms books. We have a number of things on pre-order, but currently in stock, our most popular books are our World War II series. We have Small Arms of World War II from the USSR and from the United States, both in stock and shipping. We have our Cold War Battle Rifles book. This is actually due to arrive at our warehouse in about a week. So unless something goes tremendously wrong, these will be shipping in time for Christmas as well. And that's a super cool book right there. If you're interested in something that is a little bit less coffee table book, more detailed reference book, we have a bunch of stuff for you as well. We have Rifles on the Danube on Hungarian AKs. We have, of course, my first book, Chassepot de FAMAS, on French military rifles, and very good friend of the channel, Jonathan Ferguson's book, Thornycroft SA-80, about British bullpup rifles. Perhaps something a little more obscure, we have Clockwork Basilisk on the Collier and Wheeler revolvers, early self-cocking revolvers, extremely cool. This is, there are more pages in this book than there are Collier revolvers that were ever actually originally manufactured. We have a pair of cool Japanese themed books, one on Japanese imperial swords and one on tobacco of the Japanese Empire in World War II. This is something that a surprising number of people actually have in collections because a bunch of it came back. And, of course, lest I leave it out, my other book, Pistols of the Warlords, also in stock and shipping. And, of course, we have a handful of smaller books as well, like Jonathan Ferguson's monograph on Who Invented the Wheel Gun. This is a compilation of several different cool essays related to the origins of the revolver. We also have Arming the Dragon, Dolph Goldsmith's monograph on Chinese Mauser, Warlord-era Mauser rifles, and a number of other small things. And of course, we've got the pre-orders for our book on the guns of James Bond, as well as my currently running Kickstarter for Forged in Snow, Finnish Small Arms, 1917 to 2025. So almost no matter what kind of guns you're interested in, I think we have something for you. So I'll include a link in the description text below to Headstamp Publishing. Check it out. Find something cool there. Thanks.